United States and around the world. This is Reliable Sources, our weekly program about the media. Now, this was not a normal week, so this is not a normal show. President Trump's actions and inactions in the wake of Charlottesville are provoking some uncomfortable conversations, mostly off the air, if we're being honest. In discussions among friends and family and debates on social media, people are questioning the president's fitness. But these conversations are happening in newsrooms and TV studios as well. Usually after the microphones are off or after the stories are filed, after the paper's been put to bed, people's concerns and fears and questions come out. Questions that often feel out of bounds, off limits, too hot for TV. Questions like these. Is the President of the United States a racist? Is he suffering from some kind of illness? Is he fit for office? And if he's unfit, then what? These are upsetting, polarizing questions. They're uncomfortable to ask. But we in the national news media can't pretend like our readers and viewers aren't already asking. They are asking. This is how deep the country's divide has really become. My impression is that since President Trump's inauguration, there's been a lot of tiptoeing going on. His actions have been described as unpresidential, as unhinged, and sometimes even crazy. Now, that word crazy can be interpreted several different ways. It gets said a lot more in private than it gets said on TV. For instance, this next soundbite was never meant to be heard on TV at all. Last month, Republican Senator Susan Collins was overheard on a hot mic saying that Trump's handling of spending was incredibly irresponsible. Democratic Senator Jack Reed responded by saying he thinks Trump is crazy.
He's just crazy. I mean, I don't say that lightly and as a kind of, a goofy guy.
This week, Republican Senator Bob Corker questioned the president's stability. Watch.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
Now, some Democrats, not surprisingly, have gone a lot further. California Democrat Zoe Lofgren asked if Trump has early-stage dementia. She said she wants a mental exam conducted. Another California Dem, Jackie Speer, called for Trump's removal under the 25th Amendment. And Al Gore said Trump should resign. We're also hearing this in some liberal corners of the news media and the entertainment world. You saw late night comics got very serious this week. Jimmy Kimmel made jokes about making Trump a powerless king, but he meant what he said about getting Trump out of office.
Desperate times call for desperate measures, and I'm asking you, the people who supported Donald Trump, to step in and help for the good of this country. Mike Pence is ready. He's boring. He's relatively sane. He looks like a neighbor you might borrow a lawnmower from. Let's get him in there before it's too late. Let's make America Great Britain again.
Now, if you've picked up your Sunday paper, you've seen that the papers are filled with cries for change. This is the Los Angeles Times, the liberal editorial board there saying enough is enough. Trump is, quote, a danger to the Constitution, a threat to our democratic institutions. Now, all this brings me back to those questions that are tough to ask out loud on national television. Is the President of the United States suffering from some sort of illness? Is he racist? Is he fit to be commander-in-chief? And one more. Is it time for objective journalists, and I don't mean opinion folks, I mean down-the-middle journalists, to address these questions head-on? And if so, how in the world should they do that? The famed investigative journalist Carl Bernstein says yes, these questions should be asked. He's joining us today along with acclaimed presidential historian Douglas Brinkley and Alice Stewart, the Emmy-winning former news anchor and former communications director for Ted Cruz's campaign. Carl, first to you, because you've been asking about the president's stability for quite some time. What is it that you think reporters should be doing to tackle this very uncomfortable subject?
I've been raising questions as a journalist about the fact that Republicans in Congress, the highest of intelligence officials, the highest of military officers in our country, leaders of the business community, all of whom have dealt with the White House, and many of them dealt personally with Donald Trump, have come to believe that he is unfit for the presidency. That's what I'm learning as a reporter, talking to many, many people in Washington who over the last month or two have come to that conclusion. And especially among Republicans in Congress, they have been raising the very question of his stability and his mental fitness to be president of the United States. This is not me, Carl Bernstein, saying this. This is me, Carl Bernstein, being a reporter. And what I have advocated and said, it is a important, crucial, dangerous story that reporters need to start making their business to do the reporting, to go to all the Republican members of Congress and talk to them in private or on the record, if they will, about what they believe to be the fitness or unfitness of Donald Trump to be president of the United States.
But when reporters do that, they usually get a no comment, right? They usually get a no comment. How do we get to this issue if GOP leaders won't talk about it?
First of all, I think that you're not going to get too many people who will do what Bob Corker did on the record and question the president's stability, but let's find out. But I think the first task is to remember that most of the good reporting, real deep reporting, investigative reporting we do, does involve anonymity for our sources. And we need to know that people don't have an axe to grind. I don't think we ought to be talking to Democrats about this question. Primarily, we need to go to the Republicans in Congress. We need to go to the top intelligence officials, military officials, and ask them on background, as we call it in our profession, and perhaps off the record, what do they think about the president's stability and fitness to be president of the United States. Because many of those, for weeks and even months that I've been talking to, have openly questioned it. And in the last couple of weeks, it's become a cascade, a torrent, a river of serious questions about whether the president of the United States is fit and stable enough to be president.
So if that's the case, Alice, if what Carl is saying is the case, that there are these folks, these leaders in private who are questioning the president's fitness, isn't that the biggest story in the world right now?
Look,
Yes.
First of all, this is not the first time this question has come up. If you recall back during the campaign last year, Donald Trump himself, candidate Trump, questioned Hillary Clinton's fitness to be president due to her private email. So we've had this question asked many times before. However, from as a previous journalist before I got into politics, if people are raising this question, which we're seeing across the aisle, it is a legitimate story to cover. It is a legitimate question to be asking people because elected officials are raising this issue. However, oftentimes what we're seeing lately is it's a lot of Democrats that are raising this question, and specifically in light of what has happened in the last week with regard to the president's response to Charlottesville. There's a lot of emotion as a result of that, and we're having many Democrats questioning his stability, and of course, as you mentioned, Bob Corker as well. But I think it's really, really important to consider the fact that while we disagree on the issues, when we're talking about someone being unfit, I view this much more as a political issue than a medical issue. Many people disagree with the president's policies. Many people this week have questioned his moral take on some of these issues that we're having this week with regard to racism and hatred. While he did denounce it, some of the moral equivalency he placed on that has raised a lot of questions. But I think it's really important when we're talking about his fitness for office, and there's been questions about the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, whether or not he should be removed for medical reasons. We did have Democrat Adam Schiff on with Jake earlier saying we're way too far away from even considering the possibility of removing him from office. I think if people are raising this question, it's a valid topic for journalists to cover. However, we need to look at this whether it is more of a political difference as opposed to a serious medical problem.
And Douglas Brinkley, when we're talking about these issues, if reporters are trying to pursue some really disturbing questions about the president's fitness for office, aren't many conservatives and many Trump voters going to interpret that as just the press being the opposition trying to subvert their vote?
Well, there's no question, particularly the Trump Republicans are going to look at it that way. But Senator Corker is a real leader among Republicans, and it was very brave of him to step out and really talk about the fact that we have an incompetent president and what does that mean for our country. There are things that can be done right now. I mean, on the medical front, look, we all know he is a neon billboard for, overt narcissism, malignant self-love. We've all known that, and now we're seeing that we're getting the ramifications as a nation of what having a sick man in the White House means. I think the Senate might need to move forward. He is. He's not mentally stable, and we need perhaps the Senate needs to do a censor coming up here. General Kelly is going to have to continue to try to stop him from taking to the mics and dividing our country like he did at Trump Tower. There's got to be some effort to control his tweets, but the government's going to have to run. The White House has to run almost around the president. We saw Nixon with H.R. Haldeman. He would tell Haldeman, go bomb Brookings Institute, Nixon, or go bomb Wounded Knee, and people just started disregarding what Nixon said. Henry Kissinger regularly didn't listen to his president. I think we're at that state now when the 5 generals of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have to go out and enter politics and say, we want nothing to do with what the president is saying. It is a crisis going on in the White House, and it's about Donald Trump's fitness for command.
I agree with you that this is the White House in crisis. It's not that we're waiting for a crisis to happen. I'm sorry, Carl, please go ahead, yeah.
Well, what I wanted his point about a crisis and a dangerous situation is absolutely right. And that is, again, what we ought to be reporting only in terms of what Republicans, particularly military leaders, are saying in private or publicly. But this is not I don't think this is a question of removal from office under the 25th Amendment in a highly politicized event such as that, which is very unlikely to happen. The national emergency that some of these Republicans are talking about in those kinds of terms are their view that the president is unstable, not competent, also not honest, so that there has been a basic deterioration of the conduct of the president of the United States and how to deal with that. Our job as reporters is to find out what the real story is there. Maybe what I'm being told is not as pervasive as I believe it is. Let's find out. But we need, as journalists, to make this our primary function right now in many regards in terms of covering this presidency, but doing it very thoughtfully and carefully. And this is not about our opinions. This is about what others are saying who know the president and the institution. And incidentally, there are people who have left the White House that I've talked to that say the same thing and are very worried about the stability of the president of the United States.
And to your point, Carl, it's not about our opinions. Alice, how is it possible, Alice, as a conservative commentator, someone who worked on Ted Cruz's campaign, is it possible to cover this subject without further alienating Trump voters?
Look, clearly Trump voters, as we've seen over the last week and throughout this entire campaign, they're going to stand by him. They are going to be with him through thick and thin, come heck or high water. And we've seen evidence of that this week. Look, there have been outrageous claims brought up throughout this campaign. Stories about Ted Cruz's father being involved in the assassination of JFK, and reporters would routinely call me during the campaign and say, I know this is ludicrous, but I have to ask this question. And I view a lot of the journalists covering this, that it may seem outlandish to question the president's fitness for office, but it is something, if people are talking about it and people are raising the issue, it's their responsibility. And certainly many
Americans are, yeah.
Well, it's their responsibility as journalists to follow up and do the coverage. Also, to remind everyone what General Petraeus said when he was asked about this at the Aspen Institute, he said it's immaterial with regard to his fitness because he has surrounded himself with good people. When we're talking about Mattis and certainly the new Chief of Staff Kelly and others in the White House, they're looking at that aspect, surrounding himself with good, strong people that will help him make the right decisions and help him stay on track and lead this country.
Panel, please stay with us. We're going to bring you all back right after a quick break. And also this hour, according to the president, fake news now has a new adversary in Steve Bannon. We'll talk about Bannon's departure from the White House, plus the images of hate across television screens.
Polo, a pretty special moment today, not long ago, as protesters and police came together. Let's take a listen to that.
Boston strong! 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 Boston strong!
Polo, that's quite the contrast with what we saw last week in Charlottesville. The protesters and the police, they're chanting together, Boston strong. You've been on the scene. What can you tell us?
And Jim, quite the contrast after those pictures were shot. There was quite the tense moment here, but an immediate change when one of the Boston top officials arrived here and essentially requested some of these officers pull back. And then the conversation began, Jim. And the man who was in the middle of the conversation, Police Superintendent William Gross. Yeah. Chief, you came out here. You had this discussion with people after what was a fairly tense moment.
People were very passionate.
And what was the outcome?
The outcome is positive dialogue. What we took away from here today, we talked about a victory that we had on the Boston Commons. That we stood together as a city, and especially the youth of the city, some are standing around, thank you, my brother, and we took away a victory that we told people that are racist, that are hate mongers, that this is not accepted in Boston. And you saw many nations together today combating racism. So when it got contentious, I saw a lot of the folks in the audience there in the crowd that I knew from the streets. And so I simply went up and asked, like, what's wrong, right? And then they said, we just want to walk through. So I had the officer step back, and then I talked to the people I knew and other people that I had just learned of. And we talked about take away of victory today, that in Boston, as you look around, nothing's burning, nothing's stolen, nothing's looted, that the young people of Boston, their parents, their loved ones, and especially the young people of Boston, you know, this is a victory today to stand together and drive away racism. Anything negative that happened, that's unfortunate. But there was victories today. There were victories, and we need to work on everything else now that we found that common ground. The mayor, the commissioner, the city councils, the clergy, and we will not forget the youth today. Y'all brought it. That's the victory, having the dialogue after a victory to fix things for the future.
Chief Gross, really do appreciate you taking some time.
Thank you. Now that I know you're not one of the kids, you know, thank you. But
thank
see
you,
these
Chief.
brothers here, y'all brought it today. Thank you.
That clearly is an indication again, Jim. We have seen that conversation that's happening. Things did take a turn. The police chief did speak about some of the negatives. Yes, some officers did get hurt, some minor injuries. Yes, some arrests were made. But ultimately, this is where it all ended in a positive way. And as the chief admitted, still things need to be learned. And of course, people need to move forward. Taking a lot from this moment, Jim.
Polo, we know you're not one of the kids, but I think it does. I think it is worth taking a moment and just appreciating what the police superintendent said to you there a few moments ago,
right,
when this really could have unraveled, where this could have just been a repeat of what happened in Charlottesville a week ago. The country has just been weighed down with this heavy atmosphere after the president misfired earlier this week on all of this badly. To see people come together and chanting with the police, Boston strong, and the police superintendent to come out there and say that everything turned out all right in a major U.S. city when the elements were there, that we could have had big trouble. Polo, that's a great interview there. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We appreciate it.
You bet, Jim. No problem.
All right. Thank you, Polo. The president tweeted earlier about the protests in Boston, and this is worth noting now. He wrote, quote, "Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston. Police are looking tough and smart. Thank you." I guess the president missed the protesters singing and chanting with the police there. We should point out, he did reverse course later on in the afternoon and tweeted this: "I want to applaud the many protesters in Boston who are speaking out against bigotry and hate. Our country will soon come together as one." It's worth noting all of this because the president said earlier this week he likes having all of the facts before speaking. That obviously was not the case earlier today when he tweeted about anti-police protesters and agitators. So here are the facts straight from the Boston Police Commissioner.
Overall, again, everyone did a good job. 99.9% of the people here were for the right reason, and that's to fight bigotry and hate for the most part here today.
All right, let's bring in our panel. Joining us, CNN political commentator and KABC talk radio host John Phillips, political commentator and former spokesperson for Breitbart News, Kurt Bardella. And here with me in New York, CNN political commentator, op-ed columnist for the New York Times, the great Charles Blow. John Phillips, let me go to you first. You heard the Boston police commissioner there and the superintendent, who was just phenomenal there a few moments ago, talking about how everything turned out right. But the commissioner saying that 99.9% of the people there today for this protest were there for the right reasons. Yet the president's gut reaction, as we saw last week in Charlottesville, his gut reaction is sometimes tone deaf. He talked about anti-police agitators. What happened to waiting for the facts, John?
Jim, I don't know if you've ever noticed this in any of your interactions with the president, but he has a bit of an ego and considers himself to be a counterpuncher. So my guess is the president turned the TV on this morning and saw some signs that were unkind to him and saw some scuffles with the cops, and that was the counterpunch that came out. He watched some more TV, saw the rally was relatively nonviolent, then saw the mayor and the police commissioner say everything was A-OK, and you saw the subsequent tweets, which I think were accurate and should be celebrated, because anytime you have the vile incident that we had last week in Charlottesville, the best way to handle horrific speech is to do it with more free speech and to show that we can be better, to show that we can make arguments that denounce these racists and Klansmen and white supremacists, which is what you saw today. I think today is a good day that should be celebrated.
Absolutely. Kurt, do you think the president missed an opportunity to turn the tide today? He seemed a bit off in his tone in that initial tweet, talking about anti-police agitators. And then a few moments ago, we're showing video of the protesters and the police officers chanting Boston Strong together. What do you make of that?
You know, Jim, it's almost as if this president is rooting for conflict, rooting for divisiveness, rooting for violence, rooting for anything that will somehow justify his completely unjustifiable remarks last week with everything that happened in Charlottesville. And it just shows that this isn't a president who cares about getting the facts. It's not a president who cares about actually learning what happened and paying attention. It's a president who is all about trying to find a way to frame everything through his narrow-minded lens to try to justify everything that he says and does, most of which is completely unfactual, most of which derives from information that is either twisted or turned or completely devoid of reality. That's just Donald Trump. And it shows also that this isn't about all the ruckus about Steve Bannon. Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and nothing is going to change with Bannon gone. And we saw that with just the tweet that he launched today.
And Charles, I mean, to me, this moment says it all. This video of the police with the protesters, they're hugging, they're embracing. Such a contrast with what we saw in Charlottesville a week ago. And yet the president just can't seem to get it right. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, the presidency reveals you, right? I mean, the spotlight is always on you, every move you make, everything that you say, and you cannot hide who you are. Eventually, whoever that is, for good or ill, it will be revealed. And we are seeing patterns develop from him as president. Forget what he did before, but just as president. He's slow to condemn violence against minorities, against Jews, against Muslims. He's slow to condemn the alt-right and white supremacists. He is quick to condemn, even when he is wrong, people who he assumes are Muslims, Black Lives Matter, people who he assumes are against him. He's quick. And like you said, he digs himself a hole because he's very, very often wrong.
Does he get any credit for reversing course later on in the afternoon and saying, well, it's time to come together and heal? I know he misspelled heal at first.
No, I just don't think so, because as it was reported on television, he literally made that tweet, at least it was reported that way, while the press conference was going on, when the police officer stepped to the mic and said, this went well, right? So there's something profoundly flawed in the man. There's a character issue here. There's a morality cavity where your impulses do not align with what we expect a moral man to be. Even if we disagree on policies, I virulently disagree with his policies, but I do expect each president to have a sort of moral compass that leads you to at least articulate the right things and to reach out to the rest of the country. And this idea of constantly saying his base and him saying his base and him having political rallies. There's something wrong about that because the election's over. We'll have another one for 4 years. At this point, you have to rise above it and say, you may not like me, you may not believe me, you may not voted for me, but I am your president, so I'm going to do my best.
And John Phillips, what do you make of that? Charles Blow saying that the president just lacks a moral compass, that he doesn't know how to respond to situations like this because it's just not in him.
Well, I spoke to someone who talked to the president recently, and the president thought that his initial statement was a universal condemnation and was caught by surprise when it was met with outrage and people were criticizing him, which is then when you saw the statement that came out on Monday, and then you saw the angry press conference on Tuesday when he felt that he was under attack. When he feels like he's under attack, and we've seen many of these stories with the same beats, he digs in his heels and fights back. And it becomes less about the issue of whatever it is that we're talking about and more about him fighting with the media or fighting with his critics.
Well, I certainly know that all too well. Kurt, let me turn to you. Before Steve Bannon was fired yesterday, the president was in for a terrible news cycle. The mother of Heather Heyer was saying she didn't want to meet with him. Mitt Romney was saying he should apologize to the country. What do you think the White House should do about all of that? Obviously, the Bannon news, whether it was a distraction or whether he was supposed to be fired yesterday, that's all going to go away. He still has to deal with this issue where he just failed everybody when it came to Charlottesville, and as we saw earlier today, he still can't seem to get it right.
Well, I think if the president really wants to try to hit the reset button, he's going to have to completely change his approach, both to dealing with these national moments and opportunities to demonstrate leadership and some sort of moral leadership, but also in how he engages policymakers on Capitol Hill, actually trying to be bipartisan, actually being engaged in the policy process. So much of the lack of action on his agenda, whether it was trying to repeal and replace Obamacare, get tax reform done, infrastructure, it's because he's completely MIA in any of these conversations. Other than sending some tweets out, he doesn't actually engage. He doesn't talk with congressional leadership. He doesn't talk with policymakers. There's such a lack of substance to Donald Trump. It is alarming, and it's the reason why he can't get any traction and get actually any legislative accomplishments. I think if he wants to try to hit the reset button, get some momentum for his presidency, he's going to have to abandon this catering to the alt-right and actually reach across the aisle and try to get something done.
And yet, as we understand, gentlemen, he has some campaign-style rallies coming up later on next week. My sense is that that reset button is being put off to the side. He's going to continue to go back to the base, maybe push the reset button with the base over and over and over again. Charles Blow, Kurt Bordella, John Phillips, thanks so much. We appreciate it. And amid the fallout from Charlottesville and a growing rift within the Republican Party, House Speaker Paul Ryan takes part in a live CNN town hall. Do not miss this.
President Trump's comments about white supremacists earlier this week. It's not the first time that he's been accused of espousing racist views. Take a look.
Look, I feel strongly about the fact that Barack Obama should give his birth certificate. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. He's a Mexican. We're building a wall between here and Mexico.
Will you unequivocally condemn David Duke and say that you don't want his vote or that of other white supremacists in this election?
Well, just so you understand, I don't know anything about David Duke, okay? I don't know anything about what you're even talking about with white supremacy or white supremacists.
Joining us, someone who knows President Trump more than most, CNN contributor and Donald Trump biographer, Michael D'Antonio. His book is called The Truth About Trump. Michael, would you call President Trump a racist?
Well, you know, we can't look directly into his heart, but his record is dotted with racist remarks and sentiments going all the way back to when he was very young, and joined his father's firm and complained about reverse discrimination, which was an absurd concept because he didn't want to comply with fair housing laws. And even the clip you just played about David Duke, he spoke at length about David Duke 17 years before, when he was thinking of running in the Reform Party for president, and then backed out and complained that it was because the Reform Party had guys in it like David Duke. So this is a a long established record. The thing I always go back to with Donald Trump is that he's one of the most isolated people I've ever encountered. I've never met someone who lived his whole life in such privilege, but also such isolation, where he rarely came into contact with people different from him. And really, he never came much in contact with anyone who would disagree with him. He talks about soliciting input all over the place, but everyone he has taken input from over the years happens to have been dependent on him for a paycheck. So
you're speaking of a lack of diversity in his life and exposure to that diversity. And you have a new CNN op-ed I want people to know about so they can go and read it. But let me just quote a portion of it. You write, as Donald Trump Jr. told me, the family believes in the racehorse theory of human development, which holds that they are superior to others by virtue of genetics. Explain that.
Well, right. And the president himself told me that he had a genetic gift for real estate, whatever that means. You know, I think that they have this strange concept that simply by virtue of being born a Trump, you're superior in judgment and intelligence. The way that Donald Trump Jr. put it to me was that if you put together a really great woman and a really great man, and he was really talking about breeding, as you would breed horses, you're going to get a really great offspring. Now, this is something that all people around the world categorically reject as racist. You know, there's no evidence that there's any difference from group to group in terms of intelligence and abilities. So it's a very noxious view, but it's something that I think Donald Trump has carried with him through life, and it affects everything that he says and does. So when we heard him speak last week, the third time, you know, the first two times he was hesitant and unclear, but the last time he made it very clear how he feels. And he, you know, the thing that really struck me there too is he didn't want to talk about moral differences. He said, I'm not putting anyone on a moral plane.
Do you think he understands the moral differences? I mean, do you think he understands why people were offended by his comments?
You know, I think he does. I think deep down he does. He's not a stupid guy. He's smart enough. He's been reading the newspaper for 45 or 50 years. He's an avid consumer of news. He knows we went through a civil rights revolution in this country where equality became expected and became the norm. So for him to talk about there being equal moral status for people espousing racism and people espousing acceptance is, you know, he knows what he's doing. He's pandering to the people he identifies as his base. It's a very small number of people, as we saw in Boston today, but he's pandering.
So, well, since Charlottesville, a lot of people have said that wasn't okay. A lot of people have abandoned the president. CEOs, executives started resigning from his councils, forcing him to end at least a couple of them. The Arts and Humanities Committee resigned. At least 15 charities have canceled events at Mar-a-Lago. The mother of the young woman killed in Charlottesville, Heather Heyer's mother, she says she doesn't even want to speak to the president. Do you think any of that bothers him?
Well, I think it must. I don't think that you can be rejected so roundly and not be affected and not take it in. And certainly his children and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, they understand what's going on here. The problem with the president is that the more he's pushed, the more he digs in. And so it's a very self-defeating thing. Now that he's isolated in the White House without really friends in Congress, really no friends in the business world, how is he going to accomplish anything? And of greater concern for all of us is, how is the government to function? You know, how can we rely on stability in our government when he doesn't seem to be able to move in any direction successfully?
All right, Michael D'Antonio, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you, Anna.
Near Richmond, Virginia today, a state policeman who lost his life while supporting police during last weekend's Charlottesville rally was laid to rest. This was the public memorial service this morning for Lieutenant Jay Cullen. He and a state police pilot were both killed last Saturday when their police helicopter crashed in a wooded area near Charlottesville. Virginia's governor spoke at the service.
Today, we lost a member of our family. Dorothy and I are heartbroken. It'll never be the same when I step into that helicopter and not see Jay in that front right seat with Cullen on the back of his helmet.
Back in Charlottesville, the man charged with murdering a woman by driving his car into a crowd of counter-protesters last weekend now has a stack of new charges. I'm talking about James Alex Fields. He's already charged with second-degree murder and several counts of malicious wounding in that horrific crash where 32-year-old Heather Heyer was killed. CNN's Rosa Flores joins us from Charlottesville. Rosa, tell us more about these new charges this man is facing and what's next in the case.
You know, Anna, we are learning more about these additional charges. These are 5 felony counts, including 2 counts of malicious wounding, 3 counts of aggravated malicious wounding. And of course, these stack up onto all the counts that he's already facing, which include second-degree murder, 3 counts of malicious wounding, and 1 count of hit and run. Now, we are following his case very closely, of course. We know that he is sitting in a county jail right now. No bond has been set. A bond hearing is pending, and he has been appointed a public defender. Now, we do know that this individual is the former county prosecutor, so someone with a lot of experience, and his next hearing is set for August 25th. Anna?
Rosa, you also have something new to report about Christopher Cantwell, I understand, the white nationalist that was so prominently featured in that Vice News special in Charlottesville. What is that?
Indeed, CNN learning from a senior law enforcement source familiar with this investigation that other warrants have been issued, including, like you mentioned, for Christopher Cantwell. He is the white nationalist, who was featured very prominently in that Vice.
And rightly being hailed as such for pushing his fiancée out of the way as that car plowed into those counter-protesters in Charlottesville. The couple